So the next piece here next policy or general set of policies that we can look at is sort of the answer or the question of who pays a tax. And so let's look at a sales tax. Now that might be, we could look at an income tax as well, but we could look at a sales tax. We have our demand, we have our supply. You can pick a market, right? If a sales tax is too foreign to us, let's think about the labor market. That's an option. But maybe we think about just putting a tax on, on cars. So we're going to put a tax on the sale of cars. Who pays a tax? Well, it turns out there's a big difference between who collects a tax and who pays a tax. Because we could look at a couple options. Now again, for us to be stable, we're always going to need to be somewhere where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. And so what would that look like? Well, we could try a few things, right? We could look at what happens when consumers pay the whole tax. In other words, consumers walk in, pay that much to the store, and I'll use this as my size of the tax, at which point when they get home, they have to send in that much money to the government or the treasury. And so consumers consume that quantity. Well, producers receive this much. So if that's the cost to consumers, and that is the benefit to suppliers, suppliers are going to want to supply that quantity. Are we stable? No, because stability happens when quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. What would we call this? Well, here's the quantity demanded. Here's the quantity supplied. This represents unsold goods, or what in technical jargon is called a surplus. Again, it's a little unfortunate because we have consumer, producer surplus, total surplus, and now we have another surplus here. This is a surplus of goods. So what happens when we have a surplus of goods? Well, we understand that we would expect the price to fall, except for now, the issue is we're dealing with multiple prices here, but we can wrap our heads around that because price, remember, is shorthand for the cost to consumers and shorthand for the benefit to suppliers. So what we know is that the cost to consumers has to be below this point right here, and the benefit to suppliers has to be below this point right here, or else we're not going to be stable. So we could look at the other extreme. We could look at, what happens if consumers walk in, they hand over this much, and the producer is the one that pays the entirety of the tax. In other words, they have to hand over the money, and now what's true? Well, consumers consume this quantity now, right, at this lower cost to them, and those producers, just erase this here, producers want to produce that quantity there. What do we have? This is a shortage, or in common parlance, empty shelves. So what happens next when we have empty shelves? We would expect the benefit to the suppliers to go up to encourage them to bring more to market, and we would expect the cost to the consumers to go up to encourage them, to communicate to them, to cut back. So what we've demonstrated is, through that process of elimination, because this is the nice thing, we can try some stuff, that the cost to consumers will have to be less than this amount and greater than this amount. And the benefit to the suppliers will have to be between here and here. All right. So what would cause us to be stable? Well, let me just pick a place, except for I'm not going to. If we think about what's happening, the benefit to suppliers plus the tax is equal to the cost to consumers. We could rewrite this as the benefit to suppliers equals the cost to consumers minus the tax. And if we want to write this more generally, the benefit to suppliers will be less than the cost to the consumers. So let's see if we can figure out what would cause us, what would cause us to be stable right here? Well, what would cause us to be stable, so I'll just put that as our new quantity. What would cause us to be stable right there is if consumers bear a cost equal to that and producers receive a benefit there, then we would be stable. What would cause us to have that happen? Well, if this gap here was equal to the tax. So the problem with these other situations here is that the gap between these was actually too large. Right here, when this distance is exactly equal to the size of the tax, then these conditions will all be satisfied. You might say, but wait, doesn't this shift supply or demand? Well, go down our list of determinants. Now, sometimes, and I think the textbook sometimes lists taxes and subsidies as a determinant of supply, but there's no reason it should be. What is a tax doing? It is changing just the benefit to the suppliers, and it is changing just the cost to the consumers. And so, in that sense, if those are the only things that change, we're moving along our schedule. Now, historically, you should be aware that the tradition in economics was to shift supply. Now, in that case, people will oftentimes have a decrease in supply as a result of a tax. Now, analytically, that doesn't actually make any sense. There has been no change in the cost to the suppliers, because the cost is the value that they would be getting if they were doing something else with their time, energy, and resources. What's actually happened is we have reduced the benefit that they receive, and that's an important distinction. So if the only thing that changes, right, in order to shift this supply schedule, you have to change either, right, you have to change some of our determinants, and none of those are changing. So this is a case where if I go down and I take the tax and I say, is this an impact on supply, demand, neither, or both? I end up saying neither. And yet something changes, and we have that intuition. We say, well, but I think something's going to change, right? And it's true. The price, or rather the cost to the consumers changes, the benefit to the producers changes. So we've now taken the information, we matched it onto supply, demand, neither, or both. And then we've figured out the direction. We don't have to do anything with the direction because neither of them are changing. And now the next question is price and quantity, which we did. And finally, we have to look at the impact on well-being here. Now, it's important to note that if this was a tax on cars and we were looking at maybe the market for Ubers, right? What would that do in the market for Uber rides? Well, I'm fairly certain that now, right, we've demonstrated that for those consumers of cars, their cost will go up, and cars are an input for Uber drivers. And so in the market for Uber rides, we would actually have this decrease in supply going from here to here. But in the market for cars, there's no reason why any of the curves are changing. But we still haven't answered who pays the tax. Now remember, turns out to be irrelevant of who we collect the tax from. So in order to know this, we're going to need to know consumer surplus, right? No tax, and then the tax. And for that, we're going to need to put some letters in there. A, B, C, D, E, F. Again, no reason why the letters have to be in specific spots. And if you end up putting letters in places that you don't end up using, that's fine. That's really not a problem. They just end up sitting there unloved, but they'll get over it. So consumer surplus before the tax. Well, consumers are getting that quantity there. So their total benefit is all of that. They're giving up this. That's their total cost. And again, if we write this out and cancel, which again, I encourage you to do, consumer surplus is E, D, and A. Producers, on the other hand, well, they receive this in benefit. And We know that this is their marginal cost, so cost, cost, cost. And so they're getting all of this, and they're giving up that. And so their net benefit is C, B, and F. Government? Is government, government is making money. This is a situation where revenue is coming into the treasury. Oh, wait, is it? There's no tax yet. With no tax, we're back where we are, right? Zero government. How about total surplus? Well, we just add those up. E, D, A, C, B, and F. How about with the tax? Well, now we know the consumers are getting this quantity here. So this is their total benefit. And that must be their cost per unit. So they are left with E. Producer surplus. They are producing this quantity. And what would cause them to produce this quantity? If that is their benefit. Again, if you need to, you can pull them back apart. And so they're getting F and G as their total benefit, and they're giving up G, so their net benefit is F. Government, this is where it's not zero. So what is government making? Now we have to turn our thinking caps back on. And we say consumers are walking in and handing over this much, and producers are receiving this much. And so, wait, where's this going? That piece is going into the treasury. And so government is collecting the tax and 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 the tax. It stops here because they're only collecting the tax on cars that are sold, and this is the number of cars that are sold. So when we look at what letters happen to be in there, government revenue is D and C. Total surplus, E, F, D, and C. Don't forget to add all three pieces. Now, this isn't saying that government revenue is a good thing. What this is saying is that these revenues are still available for us to do something else with in society. We're not taking a stand yet. We're just saying this is, right, we've raised D and C. This is still available. And so if we go off and generate some value with it, right, it's available. If we destroy it, if we go out and we tear up the dollar bills or we do something stupid with it, then this is part of the loss to society. But whether this creates value or not depends on what we do with this revenue. We'll revisit that. Don't worry for those of you who are wondering about that. So the narrow impact, right? The first order, the first round of impact before we know what we're doing with this tax revenue, the first order impact, if we go from no tax to the tax, would be our new, so this would be our, if we're going from no tax to the tax, if we're looking at the impact of imposing the tax, the impact, this would be our new, this would be our old, we would have E minus E, D, and A. The E's cancel. What are we left with? Again, I'm doing some of this in my head because I'm working with a smaller board here. This is a negative D and A. Change. So are consumers better or worse off? They're worse off, which means they must have paid part of the tax, right? How about those producers? Well, producers, F minus C, B, and F, they have lost C and B. Changing government. Well, the tax, DC minus 0. Ooh. So who paid the tax? Well, D came from the consumers and C came from the producers. Turns out both of them paid the tax, regardless of who we collected it from. So it turns out whether we collect the tax from the, and this is one of those implications, and there will be a later implication when we develop some more tools, that it turns out that who pays the tax, I mean, we could raise taxes on corporate profits. Who's going to pay those? Turns out consumers are going to pay at least part of them. Who pays how much is going to depend on something we call the the price elasticity of supply and demand. That's a preview of where we're going to end up. So don't worry about elasticity yet because we haven't covered it. Now, let's look at society as a whole. EFDC minus EDACBF. Maybe I'll write that one out. EFD and C minus EDACB and F. Get this out of my brain, make sure I'm less likely to make a mistake. Ooh, we have lost A and B. So as a society, we've lost A and B. Now, hopefully by now, you'll realize, so now we have to turn on our brains for the last step. So we turned the crank, we got up to the impact on consumer, producer, government, and total. And now the question is, where did A and B go? Well, one of the things we can look at is, what was the impact of this policy? Well, the impact of this policy was that instead of this being the quantity supplied and demanded, now this is the quantity supplied and demanded. So there is a reduction in the quantity. Now, I'm hoping this is ringing some bells for you. If we zoom in on just those pieces there, the total benefit to society, given by our demand schedule here, of those additional units, or rather of those cars that nobody gets anymore, A, B, and H. And the total value that we give up generating those cars that we now get because we take those resources and we do the other thing with them is H. And so the net benefit to society, again, we don't have to worry about whether it's to producers or consumers, the net benefit to society of those cars that nobody gets the value out of is A and B. So in other words, A and B represents the value of trades that no longer take place. Now, obviously, if we went from the tax to no tax, in other words, we looked at the impact of eliminating a tax, then these letters would be the same, but the signs would be reversed. So you have to be a little careful, right, as to what you're talking about. So this is the impact of imposing a tax. If we wanted to look at the impact of eliminating a tax, that would be going from here to here. And in that case, the change in consumer surplus would be a positive D and A. The change in producer surplus would be a positive C and B. We would lose D and C as government revenue. And we would gain A and B as part of total surplus. Okay, so that raises the question of when should we tax things? Well, taxing isn't a good thing unless there's something that we're not looking at, and we could look at things that we think are, ooh, we're going to have to hold that thought until we get to spillovers in order to fill that in. But as a general rule, what's the case? We should engage in behavior as long as the benefit is greater than or equal to the cost. And what this is telling us is that there is a cost to taxation. It has an impact on behavior. We have a deadweight loss here in consumption. In other words, we have trades that no longer take place. That, of course, would raise the question of what the benefit is. And it turns out that we don't know what that is, but we can actually say here that if the benefit to which those taxes are put, the activity, if that doesn't generate at least D, C, B, and A, then it's a bad idea. Now you may say, well, wait. We just lost A and B over here. And that's true, but remember, these are the resources that this is the value we've given up or that we've transferred to the treasury in this market. And so the total impact, if we have to cover at least this whole thing with these revenues. So if we create less value than D, C, B, and A, then we are in a situation where the cost is greater than the benefit, and this will be socially destructive. Now, again, there might be reasons why certain individuals like that policy and why they would back that policy, because maybe they benefit disproportionately from the policy, or they do not suffer right? Maybe for me, I don't really care because I don't drive a car. I only care about motorcycles. Okay, right? So there's plenty of reasons why we might get the policy. And again, that's something we're going to look at in future units. But right now, the focus is to look objectively at the impact on society as a whole, on consumers as a whole, on producers as a whole, on the Treasury as a whole, and on society as a whole. So on that margin, taxes come with a cost. And the question might be, what could we do with these revenues that would generate value? And one thing that people oftentimes say is, well, we could help fund activities. In other words, we subsidize them. That's the next piece. We're going to look at what happens when we subsidize things.